Yeah, thanks, Scott.
So, yes, sir.
So I don't mind if you allow everybody to unmute. That doesn't bother me. And I think the reason that that's important is because there's folks on here that are learning about actions. And I think that one of the best points in time that where you are to be able to share something is when you're learning it. So I know there's folks on team 8 or team 2, Event Pro Solutions or Event Pro, that have already dug into GitHub Actions. So I can guarantee you that somebody's read something that I'm not going to cover that they will absolutely know because they just read it like in the last couple of days and they implemented it. So I want to approach this more as like, I'm going to like lead us in a direction, but by all means, if you know exactly what something is, you can simply raise your hand or you can say, hey, Ram, because I don't always look at the chat and I don't always look at the hands up, or Scott can say, hey, someone has their hand up or someone has a comment. And that's perfectly fine because I don't always watch like the Zoom window when I'm doing this. So again, consider this like a thing, and I have a hard stop at 8 o'clock. So we'll get through what we can. But I do want to say that there are some things that are outside of the scope of GitHub Actions, like for this little thing that we're doing here, because GitHub Actions is a whole beast in its own right. So first, I always like to say, what is the thing that we're talking about? So if you were to look like on GitHub itself, right? So like if I were to go to GitHub, the docs, first I want to tell you is that anytime I start somewhere new today, I'm always going to start at the official docs. The official docs are always going to be your best place. I know that sometimes early in your career or in our careers, it's easy to go find like a YouTube video for somebody that breaks it down nice and like cleanly or succinctly. And so that's great. But I'm always going to go to the docs to start with. And when you get into these GitHub Actions, right? Like if I come to just GitHub Actions and I look at the official definition, because that's the one I usually like to start with. It's really just a way for us to accomplish continuous integration, continuous delivery. Sometimes you'll hear it termed continuous integration, continuous deployment. The idea is that our work is continuously being merged into that stable branch, which a lot of times we call main, right? Main is often reflective of what's in production. So just imagine that we have this site, and just imagine this is our production, right? People go here and they buy stuff. They buy logos or whatever. And then they come in here and they click this counter and they have fun. And that's how we make money. So imagine that like this is production. As a team, we want to make sure that we continuously accept changes. There's different kinds of like workflows in software, right? In the software development lifecycle. Sometimes you'll have these long running branches that are these feature branches that will run forever, like 6 months. And then finally later on, they'll be merged or they'll be feature flagged. But with continuous integration, the idea is that the work is continuously being integrated into the stable code, right? Like our main branch. And the continuous delivery part of that, or continuous deployment, is that our code is continuously delivered or deployed into production. Because we can integrate it into the main branch, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the main branch is what's in production, because there might be a tagged release that actually gets it there. Not necessarily the merge that gets it there, but it could be like a tagged release or manual release. So GitHub Actions is not the only like player in the market, and they're not even the first. So if anybody here has worked at a job before, you might have used Jenkins or Circle CI or like a bunch of other ones, like Bitbucket has their own like automation for pipelines. But I want to stress GitHub Actions because if you don't know it, I can guarantee you're going to be asked about it on an interview, on an upcoming interview. Or even if you don't get asked about it, you can at least kind of have a little bit of a wow factor if you can talk GitHub Actions. Like, why would you do it? All right, so GitHub Actions in a whole, a way to implement CI/CD or to help us continuously integrate our changes and continuously deploy and deliver them into production. but they also help with like safety. So imagine that I have this code base here, which is just a Vite app, right? And again, you might have seen this before. It's just a React application that's been boilerplated with Vite. It doesn't do anything fancy. I can run it locally. I can do yarn dev, right? Yarn install, yarn dev, or yarn and then yarn dev, and I can get the thing running locally. But let's say I make changes to this. I want to make sure that my changes are validated in a certain way. So I can run tests locally, but I want to also make change. I also want to run tests as part of the pipeline. So because environments change, right? So that's another reason if you were saying, well, I can just test my stuff locally. It's because there are different environments. So there's, our local environment, which is a beast in itself. And then we can say, well, it works on my machine. Well, if we can get it to work in the pipeline as well, when I'm talking about in the pipeline, I'm talking about the steps that run as part of this, right? The different jobs or the jobs and then the steps that run as part of this, right? And they make up a pipeline. So just think of it like a pipe, right? We have to go all along the pipe. We enter it at one point and then we get out the other side. So we get in on one side, that's our PR, maybe that's our push into main. And then the other side is, production or into the main branch. And so all these things have to run. And you can imagine that these things can be, or these steps can be many different things. So in this case, for this specific workflow, we're setting up a job, and then we're checking out our code, and then we're setting up Node, and then we're installing dependencies, and then we're building the project. So if anybody that's done front-end development understands, or even like API, we have to install our dependencies, then we can build our project, because we know that a Vite app, or specifically this one because it's run in TypeScript, cannot be rendered in the browser because the browser doesn't understand TypeScript. So we have to install dependencies and then we have to build it, which means part of that build is we have to convert it to static assets, right? To like an HTML and then JavaScript, because the browser can read JavaScript. And then ultimately we're deploying to GitHub pages. If you didn't know, hopefully you did know, but if you didn't know, GitHub pages is a really easy way to deploy sites for free. So deploy sites for free, not necessarily backends, but at least your front end. Okay, lots of talking. I like to talk about definitions for sure. So let's come over here and let's look at this one. And I can kind of share this a little bit later. Again, GitHub Actions allow us to automate your build, test, and deployment pipelines. That's what we talked about. You can create workflows. I'll show you the workflow in a second. And it can be triggered off of many different events. So hopefully we'll see that in a second, right? So we're talking about a workflow. It consists of jobs. So I think that it's very important when you're learning something is you have to build a mental model of this world. If we're talking about GitHub Actions specifically, it's important to understand like what a pipeline is, what a workflow is, and what that hierarchy looks like. So we have these workflows that will be run. They consist of jobs. They run in sequential order or parallel, and that's important because if they run in parallel, then something can't be dependent on the thing before it. We would want something to run in series or sequential order if it depends on the step before it or the job before it. Not the convention, but the thing that GitHub is looking for. So GitHub will intentionally look for a .github folder /workflows directory, and that's where you're going to have your workflows. I'll also call them, sometimes I'll call them pipelines. But in GitHub terminology, we're talking about workflows. If you're talking about like another CI/CD provider, they might use their specific terminology. So just for GitHub, we're going to call them workflows, even though I might mess up and call them pipelines. So that's important to note, is that they have to be in a .github folder /workflows. And they have to be in there because there are other things that will also be in the .github folder. They can reference another workflow workflow. So they can be modular. So you wouldn't put everything in one workflow. You can isolate them, right? Isolate the work that they do. Okay, so talking about the workflow, and then there's events, right? So these workflows can be triggered manually on a workflow call, or they can be triggered via events. And that's what most of the time what we care about. So if we look at this, static.yaml, you'll notice that it's inside of a .github folder. And then inside of that, inside workflows, and there's a file called static.yaml. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about the YAML syntax in a second, but you notice that this file is static. It's called static. It does not have to be. This is what this is called, but I'm going to change it in a second, and you'll see the impact that it has. But it doesn't matter what I call it. I'm simply going to call it something that makes sense. Right now, static doesn't make sense, so we're going to change it. Okay, so we talked about like the events, a specific activity that triggers a workflow run. Let's rearrange this because that's getting annoying. Put that there, put that there. So you notice here that this workflow is triggered on this push event, right? So on push, I wish I could stop doing that. On push, and more specifically, the main branch. So on push to the main branch, this workflow will trigger. That's the event that we're listening for, or that GitHub will trigger this event. However, there's also this other keyword here. You notice it's under the on. So let me stop and talk about this YAML file. Has anybody, give me a show of hands or something, has anybody not worked with YAML before? It's either YML or YAML. All right, good. So let me ask the people that have worked with it. Do you know what YAML is supposed to be short for? Is this a good, like, I don't know, quiz topic, or was it trivia? Somebody look it up real quick. But anyway, that's what it's supposed to be for. I don't know if it's true or not, but you'll see it in a second. All right. YAML can be frustrating. It can make you pull your hair out. And there's a reason why. And it's because of the indentation, right? If your indentation is off just a little bit, you're going to have an issue. And so we're going to talk about how to deal with that. So again, these GitHub Actions and workflow files are written in, yet another markup language. Exactly. That's what I believe it to be. I don't know if somebody just made that up, but yet another markup language, right? So here we are in markup, and you can write these. The extension can be YML or it can be YAML. It doesn't matter. They're both YAML syntax. I'm sorry, they're both YAML extensions. So if you create a workflow file and you have static.yaml and you're going to create another one, just follow the pattern. So if somebody already has one called static.yml and you're going to go and create another one, then don't go with this if somebody's already created it like this. So just follow the pattern. But again, these are both valid YAML syntax right here. All right, so we'll leave that alone for now. And you'll know that I'm going to get a little red squiggly. This is kind of important because if you don't have a linter installed, you won't know that your YAML sucks or your YAML is broken until you get into the pipeline and it fails. Until it gets on GitHub and GitHub tries to run it and then it fails. So there's at least two ways you can deal with that. Inside extensions, you can install this one. It's a YAML extension by Red Hat, and it will help. If you notice down here, it'll give you the little red squigglies whenever it's not valid YAML syntax. And then it even tells you how to update your settings for a specific extension. So again, you'll start to see the squigglies until you have valid YAML, and then it'll go away. So this is kind of very helpful, because if you don't have it, again, you'll push it thinking everything's fine. So let me see if I can cause one right here. Notice the indentation here. If I have something, you notice I just put a space in, right? I just put one space and I'm getting an error here. I'm getting a warning that says, hey, there's something wrong here. It's kind of hard to tell though, right? That my error is actually here because of this space, even though I get it down here. But at least it gives me something. It gives me something to know that this is not valid YAML. So the slightest space will throw you off, and it will cause you lots of frustration. Another way that you can do this is that you can look for a YAML validator. And you can come in here and you can pop your YAML in here, and you can validate it this way. And then you can also reformat it. So you just type in YAML validator, but this is yamllint.com. And so what I can do is I can come over here and I can take this YAML. Yeah, let's take this one. And let's pop it in here. And let's see if we can't like mess that up. Let's put that there. And let's do go. Okay, so throw me an error, right? So you notice here that there's a problem. And it doesn't exactly fix it for me, but let's see if I can do it again. No. Hit go. Well, it tells me it's valid YAML right after the fact. At the very least, I know it's invalid. It's not great, but at least I know it's invalid. Because what happens is when you get up to GitHub, then it'll break there when it tries to run the action. So anyway, that's another way that you can resolve it, is you can go to the YAML validator, or you can install the other one. I prefer to do it here because at least here you know before it goes anywhere that you've got a problem. Okay. So events trigger workflows, right? You can also, oh, the other cool thing is that you can also trigger workflows on a schedule. So a really good example of this is, imagine that this workflow needs to do something. Maybe it needs to like run automated tests. So again, we're not going to write any automated tests here, but has anybody not heard of end-to-end tests? If you're saying something, okay, I see something pop up, but if somebody's saying something, you gotta just tell me what it is. Has anybody not heard of end-to-end tests? All right, well, I'll just say one person has not heard of end-to-end tests. I didn't see any names or whatever, but all right. So usually we want to test that our application runs from end to end. That includes everything, like actual API calls, right? We want to make sure, like, imagine we were, we'll use the event booking, the event pro solutions, event pro folks, right? Whoever's building an event tracking system, I can write unit tests to make sure that when somebody clicks on an event, they can see the details of the event, right? And that's a unit test. And I can test that with React testing library, and I can say, hey, whenever somebody clicks on this, I see this, right? The accordion expands and I see the rest of the information. But if I want to end-to-end test, I might say, hey, I want to be able to test that I can hit the site as a user, I can look at an event, and then I can register for an event, right? All the way from end to end, like this whole flow, I can visit the site, and then I can check out, and then maybe I can go back and I can see my events that I'm registered for, right? So like an end-to-end flow. Or as an organizer for these events, I can go to the site, I can click on my profile, I can add a new event, then I can see the event in the list when I'm done. So the whole flow. Well, what's really nice is not only on push, but as part of, and I don't know if y'all have heard of cron jobs, I don't know, but we'll say, let's see, I'm getting the errors here. Let's see. Yeah, come on, go away. I don't even know where the error is. No, cron's valid. I just don't know where it needs to be. Anyway, I'm not going to worry about the syntax. The great thing about this is that you can also run these jobs on a schedule. So GitHub will look at your schedule and say, oh, you want to run this like every 2 days, and you want to run your end-to-end tests. So what that's great is your test can continue to run against your website to make sure that it's still working. So end-to-end tests, you might hear of Playwright, you might hear of like Selenium or Cypress, right? So Cypress is a big one. Playwright's a big one too. Selenium's kind of older. You don't hear it as much, but you can run this on a cadence, right? So this could be your EDE test. All I did was I updated the job name. I'll come back to that in a second. So these are jobs. I updated the job name, and I could say, hey, I want to run my EDE tests on a schedule. So I can use the cron keyword and then give it the schedule, and then it will run this on that schedule. So this could be EDE tests. It'll run the Playwright test that's part of that code, and then it'll fail, and it can throw me an alert, right? It can send me an email to let me know that my stuff failed. Just another example of what I could use this for. Okay, so events, lots of ways to trigger. So jobs are a set of steps in a workflow, right? So think of it, workflow is like being like the whole file, which usually will encompass multiple jobs many times. And then jobs will usually be multiple steps. So workflow, jobs, steps. And within those steps, again, the job needs a name. You tell it what virtual machine to run on. That's a whole other thing. Let's go back to this real quick. This is a set of actions. Okay, I'm sorry, let me back up. If you don't know how I got here, you can go to any GitHub repo, and you can click on the Actions tab. If you have never triggered an action, or you don't have a .github/workflows file, and you've never created an action, it'll be blank, and it'll say something else like set up GitHub Actions or something like that. The reason I see this list of actions that have run is because inside this code base, there is a .github workflows file. So anytime there has been a change made, I can go to actions and I can see it. And because of this, the way that this action is triggered, it's triggered off of every push to main. So I can see the branch right here, and I can see the commit message. So that's the commit message. I know it's a terrible commit message, but I can see the commit message. I can see the branch. I can see the commit hash. And this right here is actually the workflow name. I'll show you that in a second. So again, like Danny and some other folks in EventPro have already set this up for the EventPro team, for team 2. So if your team does not have something like this, it would be kind of great to set this up. You can also choose to go the route of having, like, let's say you're going to deploy to Vercel, of having do it for you. You're going to deploy to Netlify, but there's benefits to having your own workflow file, because you can determine what order of things happen in and if something runs. Keep in mind, if something runs is important. Okay, so then we have these actions. I should have done this. This looks better. I think that looks better. All right. So then we have these actions, right? A custom application for GitHub Actions platform, just a bunch of stuff. The cool thing about this, though, is think of actions as small modules. Small modules that can be reused. I'll leave it at that, and then we'll come back to it in a second. All right, this is where I was talking about with the runner. So we're not talking about like actual runners that go out there and run marathons and stuff. But we're talking about these actions, these workflow files, they need somewhere to be executed, right? If we think about our JavaScript code, it executes in a runtime environment, either the browser or Node.js or Dino or somewhere else. If we're running a backend, right, a Java application needs to run on a JVM, some type of virtual machine or environment in which it can execute. Well, these workflow files end up being just code, and they need somewhere to execute. They need a virtual machine in which to be executed on. And they need that virtual machine to have access to certain things. So I'm on a Mac. I don't know what machine you're on, but I'm on a Mac. And if you think about it, Xcode for iOS development requires a Mac. Unless things have changed, but Xcode requires a Mac to at least build your applications, right? That's how Apple has done it for forever. And I don't think that they're going to change, right? There's some hacky ways to get around that, but Xcode needs a Mac. If we think about like a front-end application that needs to build, what do we normally use? We normally use Node to like build it, right? Because it has access to NPM, which is our package manager. So we need, in our case, we really just need access to a Linux-based machine. If you haven't heard of Ubuntu, some people say, yeah, Ubuntu or Ubuntu, but it's really just a Linux distribution, right? So Linux has many flavors. When we're talking about operating machines, we have Mac, we have Linux, and we have Windows. But Linux has many flavors. And one of the most popular is Ubuntu. So this test or this job, this job within the collection of jobs, because of this runs on keyword, is going to execute on an Ubuntu virtual machine. I don't need to have Mac OS here because that is heavier, right? Ubuntu is lightweight. If that's all I need, then that's all I need. So there's many different things that you can run it on. If you notice over here on the left-hand side, right, GitHub provides Ubuntu, Linux, Microsoft Windows, and Mac OS runners to run your workflows. Again, these are virtual machines in order to execute these workflows or to run them. So that's why you'll hear GitHub runners. Even if you're dealing with GitLab, you'll hear of runners. It's the virtual machines that are actually executing those jobs in the workflow. All right. And I took most of this stuff here. If you're interested, most of this here is from GitHub. I just tried to bring it to a place to make it a little bit easier for you to like consume. So that's all I did there. Again, YAML, not yet another markup language. You can validate your own YAML locally with this extension, the one I showed you, the Red Hat extension, or you can go to YAML Validator or YAMLlint.com and do the same thing. Okay, so parts of a GitHub workflow file. Imagine I have this one on the left. It's super thin, right? And some of them are going to be really big, but this one's really small on purpose. So we have this name. It's optional. This name will show up over here inside the actions. You'll see it over here, and then you'll also see it down here. So this here matches the workflow name on the left-hand side, but it's optional. If you do not add it, it's simply going to use the name of the YAML file. So I want something very specific so I can know what's happening. So in this case, my first workflow doesn't work great, but just imagine that this one was building my code, right? So I might say build and test. I'm using GitHub Copilot. If you haven't noticed, that thing that pops out, that helper syntax, that's GitHub Copilot that's helping me do that. So I might say, hey, this is build and test. So when I run this, you'll see build and test, and then you'll see build and test because it's more specific or explicit to what we're doing. So that's the name, it's optional, but again, if you don't use it, it'll use the name of that. On, right? Again, on what trigger, on what events do we actually run this pipeline? On push, so this is the push event, which branches to main. I could limit this to say like not main, or I could have I could say that, hey, for build and test, I want it to be all the branches. So instead of saying push, I could say on every pull request, when somebody opens a pull request, I want to build and test, because wouldn't we want to build and test this? Because if somebody made changes to code in a PR that build and test succeeds. So we might say yes on every pull request. And then we don't even need this because we can say on every single pull request, or we can say branches, every single branch. Oh, actually, it's actually like this. Thank you. There you go. So all branches, right? So we can say on basically every single pull request, we want to build and test our code because that makes sense. It makes sense that we test. So the stuff I'm telling you right now, if you get in an interview and somebody says, why would you use, GitHub Actions? Why would you build out a CI/CD pipeline or workflow? Because we can validate every single one of our changes before it gets to production. That's the whole idea, before it gets to production. All right, back to this here. So the name on the trigger for the workflow, the jobs that we group them together. So we might have end-to-end test for one job here, and we might have another one over here for build, right? So this guy will be the build job. Again, this is the name of the specific job. And we might say, hey, you know what, this one here, it also needs to runs on Ubuntu latest. I'm going to get the collection of steps to go with it. Let me come back to the steps in a second. But jobs, we group together the jobs that make sense. So we might want to build. The end-to-end test doesn't really make sense with the build anymore, does it? So I'm going to pull this out. And then the runs on, I talked about that. That is your virtual machine that you're going to run. Most of the time, you're going to see Ubuntu latest. You might think, though, that there's a reason that you might see Mac, right? So we want to start thinking ahead. Can anybody mention why we might run on Mac OS latest? Just shout it out. Maybe we're building an iOS app, right? And this is a pipeline for an iOS app. Maybe this is a pipeline for Apple TV app. This is a pipeline for an Apple Watch app. Well, we need Mac to build it, right? So that's why we might use Mac OS. If you need something Windows specific, that's why you would use. So imagine this was like a Visual Basic or a .NET job, right? Or .NET code base. We might use the Windows virtual machine. All right. I'll get this out to you real soon. Yeah, Vision OS just came out. That's right. Time to make that money, right? If you can afford one of those, man, let me know. I want to borrow it. So there are some reasons for here. Basically, this here is a good site. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this over here. We know that we have jobs, which are a collection of jobs that we want to run. Here's one job called build. Here's another job called EDE test. We give the virtual machine that we want it to run on. And then in this one job, we give it a set of steps that we want to run. These steps are going to run in series, right? Or sequential order. So this first job will run, step. This first step will run in the build job. Then this second step will run in the build job. And then finally, it'll finish up the build job with this last step. EDE test, if you look at it currently, does not depend on build, which means that it will run in parallel. So imagine for a second that instead this was test. And what I mean by test, we'll be more explicit. Imagine this is unit tests. In order to execute your unit tests, you need like a built application, like with React testing library, right? You need it to be running. You need to be able to like reference things in the DOM, right? So you couldn't test on it unless build was done. So what you could say is, hey, unit test, I can't afford it. I don't need it to run in parallel. I need the build to happen first. Or actually, let me be more explicit because that maybe doesn't make so much sense. But I think we can all agree that you have to build before you deploy, right? So imagine we have a TypeScript application. We don't want TypeScript in production. We want JavaScript in production. So we have to compile or transpile, right? We need it to be JavaScript. So it would make sense that build comes before deploy. If they run in parallel, that's a problem. Why? Because deploy is going to fail because it doesn't have access to the built version. Or I'm sorry, the deploy will work, but when you get to production, it's going to be referencing the wrong stuff. So in that case, you can say, hey, this guy, it depends on, this is actually wrong. I was saying it in my head, but it actually needs, right? So deploy needs this other job. Therefore, deploy has to wait until this job is done. So you can use the needs keyword to say, hey, I'm waiting on build. You can also, instead of just passing it like the job name, you can also pass it a collection of job names. So let's say you had build and then you had deploy, but you're like, you know what? I really don't want to deploy until test completes, right? Because I want to build, I want to test, and then I want to deploy. So you can have another one here, like so, and then we can say runs on, and then we'll just let Copilot give me some stuff. So now we build our code base. We test that code base, like the built bundle, right? The thing that is output. That's what we want to test. And now instead of saying, hey, we're just dependent on the build, we're also dependent on test, right? We want to make sure that both of these succeed before this executes. So then we needs make sense, right? And again, test, we might say, hey, you know what? Test also needs to wait on something. And in this case, we can just say it needs the build. It needs the build job to complete. So runs on Ubuntu latest, that's a virtual machine. It needs the previous job. I'm sorry, the previous job build to complete. This will run. This one's waiting for both of those. So then when you get over here, if you click on here, instead of having just one, you'll notice you'll have this one here, and then you'll have another one that's waiting. It won't be stacked on top of each other, because when you see them stacked on top of each other, those are sequential. They're, meaning one is not dependent on the other, but you'll have one here. So if we use the previous example, remember we had build, test, deploy. You would see build, you would see test, and then you would see deploy over here. And you wouldn't get to the next one until the first one finishes. Now there is a way that you can override this, which I would not recommend, but you could override this. And you can say, hey, you know what? I don't care if this fails. Yeah, it's like that. And I can say, hey, you know what? Even if it's failure, or if it fails, I still want you to deploy. Or I'm sorry, it's actually the keyword always. So this is saying always run deploy. So even if test fails, like let's say our tests fail, and you'll see that in the pipeline, our tests fail, we're like, we don't care. We still want to deploy. Of course, that would probably be something bad. You don't want to do that, but you can overwrite it. So you can say, hey, you notice here, I'm getting this nice little VS Code, JS doc kind of thing. It causes the step to always execute. So you don't necessarily want that, but there are times when you do. So just think about that. There are times when you do. How do you might be thinking, how do I get a job to always run? Well, using if always. And then there might even be a case like this. This will be, and then I'll move on. We'll call this log error. I'm going to make this up. And we'll say it does all that. It needs the build. Let's say it also needs test. So this one needs build, and this one needs test. But let's say we only want to log an error if the previous step fails. So we want to know. So just pretend for a second that this code sends me an email, right? Sending email to Bob, test failed. So again, automation, right? Somebody asks you in an interview, why would we leverage GitHub Actions? Because we want to automate as much as possible. And we want to catch things early, right? And as quick as possible. We want to have like automated alerting, automated testing, etc. So now I can send everybody on the team an email when this job fails, right? If our build fails, if our test fails, that's just one thing you can do. Okay. I think we all know what a workflow looks like. Optional name, on what event, a collection of jobs. A job's got a name, it's got a virtual machine that it runs on using the runs on keyword. It has a collection of steps. And those steps have a name and then uses. So we're gonna talk about this part next. So you'll notice here that in what I have static YAML file on push, that's on push to main, this thing happens here. And I'm gonna show you about this artifacts down below. All right, I said hard stop at 10:45. We'll see if we can do it. Does anybody have a question before I get into this uses? All right. So uses allows a step to use another action, an action that's not defined here. So let's look at line 18. If you notice line 18, it's really just like a bash execution, right? Anybody written like in your terminal, you just write echo, right? Or in Python, you'll see this. Well, I can't remember, but like you could just go into Node and you can write echo, or you could go into a bash script and you could just write echo and just print something out. This is just a shell command. But if you notice here, and again, I gave this step something so I can see it. So again, if I expand this, you notice that there's a bunch of steps, right? So this deploy job has a bunch of steps. And let me actually show you, this is the one that we're actually looking at. You notice this deploy job has a bunch of steps, all these steps right here. So checkout, setup node, install dependencies, build project, set up pages, and then deploy to GitHub pages. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. That's all these steps. But we don't reinvent the wheel when we're writing code, right? We leverage existing modules that have been built for us. And so that's what these are. So I can give the name whatever I call it. I could say check out my code because it's awesome, right? This is the name that I'm going to give it. And then when you come over here, instead of saying checkout, right, or checkout code, you're going to see something that says check out my code. You're going to see what I put there. So I'm actually looking at the wrong one. Let's do this, bring that over. Here we are. So this is what you're seeing, checkout, right? That's the name that I gave to this action. I did not create the action. I'm simply leveraging an action that already exists. I think everybody's familiar with NPM at this point, right? Well, even if you're not, NPM stands for Node Package Manager. And NPM has a public like repository out there that you can go to npm.org or whatever it is, and you can look at all the modules that have been built, and you can install them, right? And it's the same thing that we see whenever we go to our package.json. These are my dev dependencies. I can go out to npm, and that's where these are going to get pulled from. And if I look at my yarn lock, I can actually see where they were resolved from, right? So this is the registry, the yarn package registry. You'll see someone here potentially like for npm, but it's yarn that we're leveraging here. So when you see npm, you'll see from npm. We don't reinvent the wheel, right? So I have to check out this code, meaning this code, like GitHub in the pipeline has to check out this code before it can install the dependencies. So remember, there's a virtual machine that all this stuff happens on. If I do this locally here, and I do yarn, I'm installing dependencies here on this machine. Did my computer screen froze? No?
Yes, looks like it.
Okay. That's what happens when your wife calls you at the worst time. Let me see. I don't know if it'll come back or not. I'll give it a minute. So on this machine.
If you don't mind.
Huh?
I want to, if you don't mind, I suspect maybe people have questions, but maybe the ice hasn't been broken, so maybe they feel like, I have a question, but I don't want to say it out loud because maybe I feel dumb or whatever. So maybe I can break the ice with a question that I feel like is probably dumb because I'm sure at least half the audience knows the answer to. I've never worked with virtual machines. I have heard the term, but I've never really looked into it. So as an example, my work gives me a Windows laptop, but I could still do runs on Ubuntu. And just because I'm a Windows doesn't mean it's going to stop that because it's not on my local device. Is that a correct understanding of that in a nutshell?
Yeah, so virtual machines run on like what's called like a hypervisor that give these OSs, right? These images and these OSs access to resources on the host machine. So like when we run Ubuntu, or when GitHub is spinning up a Ubuntu instance, right, in the cloud, it's really not too different than if you were to use like AWS and spin up a virtual machine there. And I'm calling them virtual machines, but because that's what is in the document, but it really could be a container as opposed to a virtual machine, because there is a difference between a virtual machine and a container, but, or, you know, containerized like image that will run that, and it shares resources as opposed to gets access to the resource via a hypervisor. So ultimately, long story short, it's a machine in the cloud that's temporary, right? You blow it away. On my machine, I have macOS permanently installed, but I could spin up a virtual machine for like Ubuntu, and it can be like short-lived, and it can spin it up. These runners are short-lived virtual machines, right? That will spin up to execute my code, and then they'll like tear them down behind the scenes. So coming back to this, I want to reuse code that somebody else wrote. At some point in time, there was lots of code here, very similar to kind of like this. Lots of stuff, and there was even like an external script that it would reference. But today, somebody encapsulated that into an action that I can simply say, hey, I want to use this library, if you will, just like npm, right? I want to install this library and I want to use it because somebody else already did the hard work, and I want to, you know, take the easy route. So again, actions checkout, if I command click on that, we come over to the browser, and you'll notice that there is a code base for this checkout, and it's version 3. And there's lots of work that's been done. And all I have to do is look at the contract, how to use it, what it accepts as kind of like, if you're thinking of like parameters or arguments, you can kind of think of it like that. What can I give it? And it will do the work of checking out my code. So there's one. And here's another one to set up node. Here's another one to do the install of dependencies. I could have done this a different way. Here's another one to set up GitHub pages. And here's another one to upload the artifact. The artifact is that pre-built, or that thing that gets built, the output that I showed you a second ago. All right, so let's say real quick, you want to build something and you're like, hey, there has to be an action out there for this because we don't go and we build our own stuff. Not anymore. Let's find it. Where do I have it? Yeah. If you go to like github.com/marketplace/actions, you can find actions that have already been built, and you simply leverage them, and they will tell you how to use them. So I'm going to search for GitHub pages real quick, because imagine you want to deploy something to GitHub pages. Here's the action that I can use, and it even like tells me how to use it. If I come down here, deploy to GitHub pages, right? And I like the documentation is pretty straightforward. Never mind this part up here. That's just, they're just creating some dummy HTML, but I'm going to get that from my code base. Okay, you notice here that they're actually leveraging that other action that we talked about. They're checking out the code. So they're reusing that as well. They're running on Ubuntu latest. This is the name of their job. Notice that this is the name of the workflow. This is the event that it gets triggered on push. So there's no branches. That means it's on every single push to any branch. So you come down here, and this is where we're actually leveraging the GitHub action to deploy. It takes some parameters, if you will, right? And then we pass to it this environment variable so that we can actually deploy. All right, I know we're running out of time, so let's move on here because I think we did cover a lot. Let's talk about this one real quick, which is what I'm using for this GitHub action here. So I have a site out there. It's just a Vite app, and here it is hosted. You'll notice that I have, again, there's one workflow, deploy static content to pages. So you notice that I'm going to update that. I'm going to actually change the name of this. I'm going to rename this to deploy. So I'm going to say, hey, this allows me to deploy. And then instead of saying deploy static content to GitHub pages, just to build and deploy. And we're going to say to build and deploy to pages. Again, that's the name, it's optional. You'll see that it's going to change here. And then you'll see it down here as well. That's the name. We're going to say, hey, on push, we'll say all branches, that's fine. Well, this one's specifically to main, but if I wanted it to build and deploy all, then I can leverage the star here. Workflow dispatch. I'm going to show you when we get over there. We have to give the token the ability to update and actually deploy. This concurrency is kind of important. What this means is that if you have another job that's running of the same workflow, it'll cancel the previous one and run the latest one. It's going to save you on like usage. When I get back over here, I'll talk about usage in a second. So I have a collection of jobs. I'm calling deploy. I'm creating some environment variables here. It runs on Ubuntu latest, right? That's that virtual machine. It's using Ubuntu instead of Mac or Windows. Has a bunch of steps. We're going to check out code. I'm going to leverage, or I'm going to use a module that's already been built. Same thing with setting up node, installing dependencies, building the project. And you notice there are spaces here. That's just for clarity. I can add spaces. That doesn't hurt me in terms of like the YAML validation. I'll add another space there. I won't add spaces here because this is one whole step. Okay, you'll notice here that it's going to build, and then we're going to upload an artifact. This is important to note because with this code base here, when I build a Vite project, it will build or output to this distribution folder. So this is the thing that's been built. And remember, I talked about testing. I need to build before I can test, right? So I'm going to build, it builds to this. So therefore, that's the thing that I actually want to upload. I don't want to upload this whole thing. If I did this here, I said, hey, upload everything. That's going to upload all this, right? I don't want to upload everything. I want to upload just what's been built to the distribution folder. And then the actual deploy, again, here's another pre-built action. So I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to stage my changes. I should have done both. We're going to say a really bad name. We're going to say update workflow name. We're going to commit and we'll push. We're going to come back over here now. And we're going to see that pop in. We'll do a refresh. Notice that this changed, right? Because I changed the name. Build and deploy pages. It's really important to know that you want these to make sense, because when you have lots of workflows, you don't want them to be too similar. You want them to be set aside. So it's like, oh, I know what this workflow is doing. I'm building and deploying to pages. You might have another one that says run EDE tests, and that might be completely separate. And then when somebody sees it, it's like, oh, okay, I'm running EDE tests, right? Notice that the workflow is running. It's going to give me, like, if it's queued, or it's going to give me the time that it takes. Again, build and deploy to pages over here, and what branch it was triggered off of. If I were to create another branch and push my changes, you would see the name of that branch here as opposed to main, and then you would see this running. If I click in here, notice what's happening. On push, right? If I click in, I can see the steps. I can see the steps, and those are the same steps that I have over here. All right, so everything completed. And it went green, it succeeded in 55 seconds. You can always optimize your workflows so that way they're faster. I've seen some workflows like in production that takes like an hour. That's ridiculous. Because you're waiting for an hour for this workflow to finish or this pipeline. That's not good. All right, so you notice I went out and I went back in because I wanted to see this. This is that artifact. This is the artifact that was output from the build stage. So when we build this thing here, it has this distribution. Then we upload the artifact, and that's what was inside the .dist. What's cool is you could come over here. I'm sorry, I should have showed you one more thing. Where did I put it? Yeah, so because we called it GitHub Pages, that's what you see over here. If you click this, of course, you see the bundle size, right? If you click this and download it, of course, you can't see it. But if I were to download this and open this up, oop, it opened up way over off to the side. It's just a zip folder. It's just a zip folder that contains this. And so that's what I want to deploy, right? So we deploy that here, and here we go. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to change this real simple thing, and then I'll kind of wrap it up because I know I went like over. So we'll go to source, we'll go to app, and then we're just looking at this here, and it says Vite plus React. We're going to say Vite plus FCC Dallas. I could run this locally if I wanted to using yarn dip, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go ahead and check out a new branch. We'll just go with that. We'll look at what's going on. I'll add that, which is the changes I just made. And then we will commit. And we'll say text, updated, title, I don't know. And then we'll push that. And then we'll come back over here and we're going to go back to our actions. Give it a second. And you know why it's not running, hopefully. Because if you look at the deploy, right, it's only running on the main branch. And that absolutely makes sense, right? I don't want the actual deploy to run on the main branch. I only want like the build. And so you'll see that it never ran here. So what I can do is I can say, hey, you know what? I'm going to create a separate workflow. And I'm going to call this build. Yeah, we'll go like that. I'm going to pull this over to the side, close that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy everything. And then I'm going to scrap out the stuff. I'm trying to be really fast so you can see this next one. So we're going to say basically this runs on all branches. We're just going to say build application, workflow dispatch. Oh, I forgot to show you what that was. I'm going to remove it for this one here. I'm going to show you what that is in a second. We don't need this because we're not going to deploy. We can not worry about that. We're going to say build. Again, this is the job. I don't need this. It's still we're going to check out the code. We're going to do this. We're going to do the install. And then we are going to do build. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just say, come on. We are going to say, this is done. I don't know. And then we'll do something like this. Fix. There we go. And then that should simply be like the last part, right? So this runs on all of them. We'll come over here. So that looks good. We'll add that. And then let's do that. I think I already did it, but we'll do commit. workflow for non-main branches. We'll push that, and then we'll come back over. And let's see if it doesn't trigger. Okay, so you notice that I now have another workflow. It got triggered off of that push, right, for this branch. So you see the branch here. You see, again, the name of the workflow. You see the commit hash. I can jump into here, and you notice that it's build, right? So I don't have the deploy part of this. I just have the build part because that's all I care about. So if you're like, hey, how does, you remember CI/CD means we're constantly integrating, we're constantly deploying, and we're constantly testing. So like for this build, we might do something. I'll add this super fast. We might say, hey, we're going to have a test which runs on Ubuntu latest. Where's it at? Yeah, that should work right there. Runs on. And then steps. Unexpected value test. Test. Where's it at? See, there we go. But it would check everything out. We would pretend that it's testing. And then we can say that this guy, remember that we don't want it to do anything until build happens. So it would be done building, and then we would actually test. And then whenever you do this, again, I'm faking this because I'm trying to go kind of fast. But now I've added another job to this workflow. And I can say add test job, commit, change it. Come over here, go back to actions. You'll notice here, still off of that branch. And now instead of having them on top of each other, I have build and then test, right? Because test needs build to pass before it can run. So that's important, right? And that's where that needs keyword comes into place. It needs the build job. So this will happen. And if this fails, then we'll stop here. We'll be dead in the water. Okay. You can also cancel the workflow here. So I'm going to show you this in settings, or actually like when you come over here, imagine that you're doing this on your own or even for like a org or a team. And you're like, hey, I want to make sure that, remember that you only have so much like usage or quota that GitHub will give you for free. So if you click on your like profile, and then you go down to settings over here, and then you come over to plans and usage under billing and plans, and plans and usage. I'm using GitHub Copilot, so that's why you see the $10 here. But if you look at actions, I don't run a lot of GitHub Actions, so I haven't spent any money, right? But if you were to like switch to another account, so like Event Pro Solutions was what Team 2 was called, I could look at their billing and plans, scroll down, and we haven't kicked off a bunch of actions. But ultimately what will happen is you'll end up running out. So if you were to like really get going and go crazy, you're only going to have a certain amount of free like minutes. So think about that. Every single one of these takes minutes, right? Because these runners are running in a virtual machine, and so there's minutes that you're allocated for free. So keep that in mind. You don't want to run this forever. If you have this workflow and it's like, I don't really need it, and it's got like 10 steps in it, just cancel it. Just hit cancel the workflow and save yourself some minutes. So keep that in mind. For the most part, we don't have to worry about it. But when you get to an organization and they start racking up, like you've got like pipelines every 10 minutes, it's going to add up real quick and it's going to eat them up in cost. So you always want to think about like optimization there. All right. That's a lot of stuff. And we haven't even scratched the surface, but we don't have more time. Oh, here's the last thing that I'll show you. there's a way that you can test your GitHub Actions locally. If you noticed here, I didn't really test them locally. What I did was I pushed them, and I'm basically testing them in the pipeline, which can be, annoying, because what will happen is when you go back here, you'll have a bunch of these that are failed, and then finally you start to go green, right? You're failing, because that's how software works, right? We fix one problem, we end up with another problem. All right, we fix that next problem, then we end up with another one. You'll see all these red, and then finally you joined up. So basically you're running all this stuff using minutes. So there is this library called Act. Again, I'll share this out here shortly. And what you can do is you can install it, and you can run your workflows locally. So inside this branch, what I can do is I can simply run Act, which I've already installed. You do have to have Docker running locally. If I scroll over here, you'll see that I have Docker desktop running. So this is what you'll notice here. Again, it's running on Ubuntu, right? It's actually this one here that's running. But I can actually come down here and see, like, if I'm missing something or something's not working. So it will, from the folder that you're in, it will look through the .github/workflows and attempt to run those using the event push as a default event to trigger those. But the documentation here is really good. And that's a way that you can test your workflows locally. If you have anything that depends on like environment variables, you're gonna have to set those up, like a secret or something. All right. I keep saying last thing, but there's another thing. Keep in mind that when you're doing a lot of these builds, you're at some point going to have to reference some secrets and variables, right? Like an API key. You want to inject an API key, and you don't want it to be part of your code base. So what you can do is you can, under secrets and variables. So again, like I'm just in the app, and I clicked on settings over here, and I scroll down to secrets and variables. And if you click on actions, you can create repository secrets and environment secrets, which you can then access from the workflow. And the cool thing is you can create multiple environments. So you could have a production environment, a sandbox environment, a test or QA environment. So you can create these environments, and you can create new environments. So this was GitHub Pages, which is this guy right here, right? And so I need to, remember I added Vite plus React. I got to fix that real quick. So let's go here, Vite app, let's do it. We're going to do it, and we're going to see that update. 2 files changed. We added this guy. Changed a bunch of like formatting stuff. Let's approve it. Oh, look at this. This is cool. This is what you want. When this fails, we want to say, hey, you know what? We don't really want to merge this pull request. So imagine if you had unit tests or end-to-end testing. If this fails, you can say, hey, we don't approve this merge request, right? And then if you click details over here, it'll take you into it, and it'll tell you where it failed. So missing script test. I'm not even sure where I added that. Oh, we'll merge it in, who cares? So merge it, go back to actions, and you'll notice now that we do see build application and build deploy to pages. When that gets done, this will be updated, and we'll say Vite plus FCC. Again, I'm using these pipelines, these workflows to test our work, test our changes real fast. We don't have to manually do all this stuff. We merge it in, and then all the steps and all the jobs that we have will run in an automated fashion. We can validate that our changes are good, that we haven't broken anything. And then when we go to click approve, we have confidence that we're good to go. Lots of talking. Oh, remember I told you this. Remember I told you that we have this workflow dispatch? Sometimes you're going to want to leverage that, because what will happen is you're going to be able to come over here to this one, and you're going to be able to manually run the workflow. You can't do that for all of them. So build application does not have the option for me to manually run that workflow or manually trigger that workflow. Sometimes you want to be able to manually trigger the workflow. Imagine you had end-to-end testing and it runs on a schedule via a cron job. But you're like, you know what? I think there's something wrong. I want to kick off our end-to-end test. Imagine this was your end-to-end test, you'd be able to come over here, click run workflow, click the branch, and you can click it. And you could trigger it like that in a manual way without having to like push something to a branch or do a PR. Let's see if this changed. There we go, V plus FCC Dallas, right? As part of our pipeline, we pretended that we tested it, which we really didn't, but we pretended like we did. And we deployed. Our changes are now have been continuously integrated, right? And then they were deployed. So that's all I got. That's my time. What are the, there's a lot more to cover, but we're not gonna do it. So what questions do y'all have, if any? No questions, everybody's an expert?
Seems like it. But I know I definitely learned a lot of stuff that is brand new information to me. So I really appreciate your talk. I really do think everyone got something out of it. Again, whether that was a refresher or maybe update information or like me learning something new. Definitely appreciate your time. Definitely appreciate you kind of giving this knowledge transfer to us. And see, Kerr says definitely cleared up some things. So I think all around applause from everybody. And I thank you so much for doing this. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.
Yeah.